All right. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. I am extremely humbled, grateful, and honored, amongst a plethora of other things, to be joined by our great friend Jeff. We did a recording with him that was extremely well received a handful of weeks ago, perhaps approaching the 2 month mark approximately. But he's back again. I have some things noted down to discuss. But without further ado, Jeff, brother, how you doing? Thanks for coming on, and I hope everything is well on your end.
I'm doing great. Things are good.
Awesome, awesome. So the first thing I wanted to jump into with a combination of pre-planned talking points, maybe like 20 minutes before I started this, and we agreed next time around we'll do a much more cohesive point form plan next discussion next time around. But the 100th monkey effect, based on your military and intelligence experience, to what extent, Jeff, can you speak on this idea of the 100th monkey effect being either full of crap or something very viable, particularly coming from a background, and please tell me if I'm wrong, where the military structure and hierarchy is very rigid. If one person or a handful of individuals, fall, off the beaten path of their chain of command, everything goes to crap. Same, one could perhaps apply this to the 100th monkey effect rippling in a non-cohesive way. Is there anything there in your opinion?
Yeah, so that's a lot to unpack there. First, let's go with the 100 monthly effect because that speaks to something I've perceived for a while. I assess is true, and this goes back to something we talked about last time, and that's conspiracy theories and where the theorists get it wrong, is they keep trying to always ascribe, premeditated culpability in each instance, human agency in each instance, when in fact, often the human actor in this is the avatar of another agenda they don't even realize. And so this alludes to this idea of the 100th monkey effect and the greater underlying collective unconscious that we emerge from, for lack of a better way to put it. So yes, and when announcing, when conducting, predictive forecasting about future events or anything, right at the bang, we sometimes, you know, project false positives onto the pattern that we're perceiving because there is an underlying force at work that we cannot perceive. Like I said last time, one of the conclusions I've just come to is, fantastical as it is the fact that there are unseen forces that operate on human history. I think I just lost you on sound there.
Oh, and I had myself muted. My bad.
Oh, gosh.
So this idea of unseen forces having an impact on human history or on humans throughout human history, whether modern, ancient, or a bit of both, perhaps. To what extent do I wonder does that potential unseen force either effectuate someone to ripple from the 100th monkey effect, whether for better or worse, we'll put that to the side. How much of that would you say is an analytical overlay of the sovereign individual themselves, and how much is it the underlying force, or perhaps the underlying force creating an analytical overlay? You see where I'm going?
Yeah. As cliche as this will sound, it all boils down to the self awareness of the individual.
Right.
The less self aware you are, the more open you are to control. And that's in any context.
Okay, so if I can apply this in a bit of a layman's practical, I'm going to use a partier example here. So if you have someone that's a big abuser of drugs or something like this idea of as say they're coming down from a high of any kind, if they're experiencing any withdrawal effects, it's not them experiencing it so much as it is perhaps their vessel, container, shell, something like this, which speaks to the idea of realizing, okay, this is going to pass. I don't need to freak out. Therefore, the body doesn't have these elevated, cardiac responses and all of that. Is would you say that's accurate or?
Yeah, I mean that's a nuanced and complex topic by itself, when someone's dope sick from coming off something. Um there's different ways to look at that,
Sure.
right? you know, and I'll come out and say that I'm certainly not morally opposed to what people do recreationally. I also see a lot of it is negative. It's just bad things to do yourself for a
Right.
number of reasons.
Right.
I've personally seen the destructive effect of, you know, uh, chemically induced false euphoria and the addiction cycle that emerges from it, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Right.
Uh, what I'm trying to say in a fanciful way is, you know, doing hard drugs is a bad idea. Don't do it.
Right. Right.
Oh,
Right. It's my fault for bringing that type of example up, but you see what I'm.
but
Yeah.
you know, but the example still serves. Um, you know, everything is a teachable moment, as we would say.
Right.
You know, and that's its own teachable moment about cause and effect, really. A cause and effect is the stimulus and response. This all kind of goes back to the phenomenon I've talked about unseen forces. Well, the phenomenon is the unseen force showing its face.
Wow, I really appreciate the way that you said that. It's the right, and it's showing its quote unquote face in a multitude of ways, perhaps.
Correct.
Right, right. Would see this is when it gets tough in the sense of we can't, maybe perhaps the point is to not pin it down, but say when, for example, a soldier's on the battlefield in a very traditional kinetic warfare sense, are they more so, say they were to be influenced by this type of unseen force? Are you of the opinion this unseen force can act in the ways of, for example, um, uh, again, I'll use this example, drugs, alcohol, or are you speaking more so to a much more naturally or emotionally induced type of force?
All of the above, right? So the average human being walks around unconscious. To go back to your combat example, and this is also goes into adjacent topics. Ironically, in combat, people are less open to control because they're so switched on and open.
Huh. Wow, yeah, I think to a large extent I see what you're saying there. Because are you saying because there's been a form of uh training induced, whether physically, mentally, or otherwise, to accept that one does not necessarily have control of their environment they're in, so situational awareness becomes.
Situational awareness. It's. I mean, there's a couple different ways to achieve this. You know, the open the aperture to the unit of consciousness. One is deep in, and the other is deep out. Right. So
Right.
there's to use another analogy. There's this idea called mushin. Right. So there's no mind. There are only a handful of times I've experienced true, real, no shit. This is the real thing, mushin. And
Mm,
that was it was in a combative context
wow.
because you were super way open to your environment and super, you know, the egoic self is all but missing. I mean, it's all but totally gone in that moment when you become pure perception and response.
So you are, to add to that, could one uh, postulate that you are becoming more, again, purely neutrally here, more ingrained in the nature of that environment? Therefore, your stimuli and response is more ebb and flow like, if you will?
Yeah, that's one you're open to field effect more. I
Right.
mean, it's its own worthy pathway of study is this idea of precognition derived from crisis context. I've seen it in multitude of ways. You see it in law enforcement. Um,
Right.
this you know preternatural ability and the moments which induce it. I mean, I've had my own experience. I don't want to go too far into it because someone's gruesome, but I've had my own experience with the phenomenon in those moments.
Would you say, oh, and again, I don't mean to pry on a personal level at all, but would you say that what people have called, for example, whether it's the chi, the prana, the isness, the force, the Holy Spirit, or direct correlation with that called intuition, would you say that's ever come into play during those experiences of yours?
Absolutely.
Okay, so you would say that this idea of
There
perhaps.
was a moment in time. where if I could have stepped out of myself and asked myself, what is the meaning of life in the secrets of the universe? I could have provided the answer. It's just in that moment, I wasn't worried about asking those questions. I was worried about not dying.
Right. Okay. So in and again, I don't mean to stay on this for too long, but and I say this with the utmost respect and humility, and I thank you again extremely for your service. In the instance and event of that feel of concerning yourself with not dying physically, is did you feel more and more of the ego letting go and pure, I guess you could say, I don't want to say neutrality, but I don't necessarily want to say
Pure
robust.
awareness.
Okay, pure. Okay, there we go. Pure awareness. And you felt at the time that, ex- I'll use this word, but correct me. Accepting the given circumstances of that environment was part of that pure awareness.
Well, accepting what is as is. There's not a lot of time for self-reflection. I mean,
Right.
again, it's its own kind of iceberg to explore about the truth of martial service, those of us who deploy, versus the narratives and dialogues that occur back here in the world, right?
Mm,
There just are no politics downrange. Doesn't matter if there's all kinds of politics back here, and it's an illusion to think that all veterans think the same. All people in the intelligence community think the same. We just don't.
right.
We argue all the time.
Right.
Um, but
Is this why, sorry, Jeff, is this why, and perhaps I'm exaggerating this here, sensationalizing it, but is this why it's been alluded to in a semi-joking manner over the decades that intelligence decisions ultimately come down to a handful of agents or officers going with data, but the icing on the cake is their intuition?
100%. I
Okay.
don't know anybody who's good at this analytically or in the operative sense, as far as source recruitment or any of those kinds of things,
Right.
where you don't uh, develop intuition, whether you call it that or not. I mean, not everybody who develops that capacity will call it that, but 100% without question.
Right.
And it's maybe even more accurate to say not simply intuition, but precognitive, because there's more than one skill set or discipline at work here, and it gets amalgamated together. I mean, we could talk esoterically, but the mystery school traditions and the noetic centers or psionic centers of the body. There's not just one. There's
Gotcha.
You actually have multiple systems overlaying each other physiologically. I'm not even talking about chakras or auric field or any of that kind of stuff. I'm simply talking about the aperture provided by your nervous system. Uh, there are
Ah.
multiple parts of it at work, right?
Right. And then that's only one side, or that is one layer within a whole onion of layers of, and that onion itself is only on the physical tangible side. We're not even speaking on the other.
Correct.
Right.
Correct. So one of the things I've theorized and talked about, uh, if I wasn't lazy and I had a bunch of money, things I'd invest in is, tactical uses of RV. Uh, Playing on this idea, RV as a collection platform operates at a certain echelon. What I would have liked to have seen it done, and maybe someone has done, and I just don't know about it,
Right.
is uh, use it at the tactical level. I'll give you an example. So you're hunting high value targets. You crawl up on a wadi village somewhere, obviously filled with a bunch of innocent people, and you've got your handful of bad guys you're trying to get to. Wouldn't it be cool if you could identify which one of those little buildings in that compound they're in, so you could avoid involving anybody else?
That's
Now there's the very physical manual ways we do that, like usually somewhere between 24 to 72 hours ahead of hitting that little wadi village. We'd have someone, scout snipers of one kind or another, with eyes on the target to try to identify that building. Um, but wouldn't it be cool if we could get that, non-local confirmation when you show up on target? Um, and there you could different ways you can echelon that back to even pre-mission. Can you douse? Can you use something like map dowsing to track, an insurgent cell? All kinds of applications like that I've thought about, that go to this idea of immediate boots on the ground versus the echelons when RV is normally employed. And I'm sure if you could talk to Dr. Putoff or whatever, they've probably tried all kinds of things like that and may or may not have chosen to pursue them based at the echelon they were at and the service they were asked to provide.
Right. So with that said, and as you were bringing that up, as you were speaking on that, rather, there's this one particular image here that I found to be interesting, and I wanted to show two images here for yourself and for the audience in real time, which is that when you speak on this concept of multiple layers, I'm sure there'd be more than obviously three here, but just even on whether the physical or the esoteric side, would you say that this would be perhaps a very fundamental explanation visually of these multiple layers?
Yeah, I mean, that certainly is as good as any of the models we may use to depict it. Again, it goes back to this triad of cosmotheological constants: panpsychic monism, emanation theology, which is the emanation and orders and scales of being. We see this in, with the greater forces at work down to our own self-apprehending individuated selves, versus in the horizontal sense from the collective, the social collective to the individual. All those kinds of things have application in that. Again, as above, so below, as within, so without. That's just proved true time and time and time again.
Right. And with that said, maybe, and I'll explain here even for yourself the visual I'm showing here, but it's really interesting that you brought up this idea of
It's a
remote
map graphic. That's terrain.
terrain, right? Okay. So imagine these forgive me if there's an official term for this, but the energy, the metric tethers or the energy strings or whatever you'd like to call it here. If these strings, whether red or blue, represent a form of induced, I guess you could say, energy from an intuitive angle. If one were to remote view a location, 2 or 3 days prior to actually, conducting the operation, say if one is remote viewing a location, this location would be the one in which they're remote viewing, which the peak would signify an increase in, we could say, energetic perspectives that one is viewing separate from their physical source or body. Would this be, in your opinion, a good depiction or not necessarily in a visual sense?
Yeah, so when we talk about everything is energy, frequency, vibration. So, and what we're really always talking about is proximity to signature.
Right.
So, if we remove time space as we understand it and we think only in string theory, proximity is, be it in time or space, is determined by vibratory resonance, right? And so that produces density because the frequency is changed by our proximity to from one thing to another, right?
Right. Right.
So you could get densities. Now, the whole future thing, there's been efforts with associative remote viewing, et cetera, to predict, to win lotteries, to win bets on football games, all that kind of stuff. And a lot of it's been proven successful. I mean, there's the old joke of, well, how come psychics aren't rich or using their psychic powers to win money? In fact, some of them do.
Right. Right. Right.
Some of them do.
As a
And
matter of fact, I could
it's
say
usually
that.
done for charity.
Right. As a matter of fact, I could say that quite avidly. I know a multitude of individuals, as I'm sure you do as well, that actually do use this and have used this on the stock market. Now, what's interesting is that I've spoken to some individuals off the record who have said to me, and please you tell me if this perhaps correlates with what you've heard or not. But this idea that if these remote viewers were using this ability for self gain far too much for themselves, whether it's making money or otherwise,
Yeah, that's true.
something would come back and hit them in the sense of a natural, literally like a natural, very unfortunate events in their lives would occur.
That's not always. I haven't heard about that in particular. I've only heard that it just seems to be less effective.
So what you're familiar with is the fact that the more one uses it for self gain on an excessive level, the less effective it becomes for them.
Yeah, and which is and again, I don't want to speak too out of school on that because while I'm a part of that community, I'm certainly no expert on and all the trials and tribulations of it. Again, a guy like Dr. Putoff would be the guy to talk to.
Right, right.
Um, but yeah, and we can find it's funny, but these very real observable effects through this process we find reflected in things like the study of the Kabbalah, and the list goes on as to service to self versus service to others, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm,
And one of the best ways to want success for ourselves is to think in terms of how our success will enable us to help others.
right.
Anyways, that's a long convoluted thing.
Well, it speaks to the whole concept of toroidal fields, and I'm not trying to get all mathematical whatsoever, but this idea of what you give, you then receive seems to be far more mathematically substantiative than people thought even 5 years ago.
Yes.
Right.
um and it all boils down to me to nested toroidal geometry. So that's perfectly acceptable to talk on those things. In fact, it's the motion of the toroid which gives us, you know, at least in part, the perception of the arrow of time.
Right. This idea that, for example, if time were to be in absolute truth a ring instead of a line, therefore denoting no absolute point in that ring that is more or less than the other, one could perhaps surmise that what we call straight lines, if zoomed in, whether literally or esoterically, or even ontologically, are just rings comprised together
They're
enough.
spirals.
Right.
Power and time travel in spirals. Time is not a cycle, a circle, it's a spiral. So even if we're in the Kali Yuga, let's say, and we're coming out of it, this Kali Yuga still isn't as bad as the last one
Right.
because we've moved up the spiral.
That you said, I couldn't have said it better myself, man. That absolutely. I mean, I would personally agree, and I would say that for the audience, whether my members or that when this goes public, I can say that some of the work I'm doing personally, whether theoretically or in experimentation, there's no I don't claim to know everything, not at all, but everything seems to lead back, whether theoretically or experimentally, in its various forms, leads back to that underlying concept of chirality and spirals. Perhaps different mechanisms or ways getting to that ultimate goal or finish line or end game, but the same finish line nonetheless, which I would ask you, brother, would that speak to you in the concept of joys in the journey with movement to the finish line instead of when, you get excited when you get there?
Yeah, the movement is the goal. So there's the idea of the future pool. And if we go back to just a couple moments ago, and we look at our cosmological models between block universe versus string theory, and versus my preferences is the in between version, which is block superposition.
Right.
Block superposition telling us that all probabilities all exist all the time, period, and you can navigate all probabilities. And so part of the problems with predicting the future being that you're not really predicting the exact future. What you're predicting is a point in probability. So sometimes you get it right, sometimes you get it wrong. But what's often forgotten about predictions is predictions don't exist so they'll come true. They exist so you can change their outcome.
Man, that's so well said. Seriously, thank you, because you've just described what I've been trying to discern in a more layman sense to the average person, what I'm seeing in some of the numbers that I run, and that it's literally that the potentials are there, literally. It's just a matter of, are there certain events within the movements prior to the potentials that will make that potential a reality?
Correct.
Right,
And
right,
so this goes back, and it's funny because we can go right from, just as we can walk from the exoteric into the esoteric, we can walk from the esoteric right back into the exoteric,
right.
because now we can start talking about trends, indicators, and predictive analysis and how predictive analysis works. and we can be talking, very overt exoteric stuff. Again, analysis of various moving parts left of the bang to determine what an outcome is going to be. And so there's also a natural interplay when you're not focused on discerning what is this precognitive superpower versus what is my prior training, observation, experience that leads me to a certain action. When you make it, when you don't try to determine the line between those two things so hardly, or so definitively, it occurs more naturally. It's more permeable. You leave the door more open for intuition to enter into your objective analysis.
So instead of a small ring of those, we could say of that fluctuation, we've now broadened the small ring into a much larger gap.
Yeah. So, and that goes to perception as well. I mean, I tend to be a big picture thinker.
Right.
I sometimes miss the details, which sometimes is, as the saying goes, God is in the details. But this going back to orders and scales of being, right? So the larger the being and scale, the less individuated subjective ego is present.
Okay, so let me just say that it's very interesting you bring this up, and I really appreciate it because this is something in the last couple of weeks I've been exploring myself personally. This idea that, for example, I'm going to go out on a limb here with this example, but people say that, when they've had encounters with whether some type of human-looking being, non-human, that's not the point of this example, but what they'll find is that a lot of times, even if the beings are benevolent or even neutral in their behaviors and responses, they're not nearly as, I guess you could say, they don't respond nearly as immediately as those with more emotional, reactionary, jerk responses do. And now we can talk about, okay, maybe it's the different wiring in the brain of these beings or whatever, but I find this to be the case even with people like yourself and with people in business, very, very smart people. They seem to relax after they hear something good or bad, absorb it, think about it, and take lots of time before they make the move to respond to it, if at all.
Correct.
Okay, so okay.
So that's, again, what are the beings showing us? And we can go, to the other topic of if and when they do make their presence, what will they be?
Right.
No, I'd argue it matters not what they actually are. They will present based on the impact they're trying to achieve.
Right.
Right. Whether it's anthropomorphic, non-anthropomorphic, whatever. That being said, so bigger picture, and now we can take this bigger picture approach where you are more open to the larger cosmic field state, and therefore you perceive all these inputs, and so you're subjectively less affected by the input because you objectively can understand the input. Let's come over here to spiritual evolution.
Sure.
And the way saints perceive the world and their ability to forgive. They perceive the larger cosmic web of cause and effect. And it's, one of the beauties of getting older, it's like, you're going from point A to point B, some guy cuts you off in traffic. You are like, you know what? I totally get that I've been the asshole myself and done that. And that guy is probably under all kinds of subjective emotional stressors and is late and is about to get a divorce, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
That caused them to do that. That's a bigger perspective. And we can take it out of that personal subjective moment for a more objective one. And let's say, again, going back to conflict and trying to understand the process of radicalization, or in the United States, how politically divided we are, how divisive things have become. The bigger objective perspective is, yeah, as opposed to being emotionally reactive and jumping on one side of that argument or another, I'm going to be above the argument and say, yeah, I understand the subjective inputs that are affecting the people that have caused them to, at points, and this is not just one side of the aisle, both sides of the aisle have this tendency to radicalize. and so that bigger objective perspective helps us understand that. So this goes back to what I said last time about the phenomenon and about how we perceive ourselves. We either like to lionize or vilify the human species. We're wonderful and our sovereignty must be protected, or we're awful Klingons and no wonder they don't trust us. We have the tendency to do both. When most likely the phenomena goes, yep, that's just where they're at, because that's the trajectory of the species. That's how it goes. You move from collective unconsciousness through to conscious differentiation, finally to reemerge at the top of the toroid in conscious wholeness. Right? You start from unconscious wholeness, move through differentiation, and arrive at conscious wholeness. Right. So it's all part and parcel of the evolution. There's nothing unnatural. Yes, we have some bad things wrong, and we need to, grow beyond them and work to that. But telling these narratives, these emotionally evocative narratives about how we're good or we're evil, or it's just ridiculous.
Right, right.
And it's not objective, because one thing I've said all along is, yeah, from firsthand experience, I can tell you there's some real bad things going on in the world that are awful. That's why there's I sort of contest the position of my peer group, my chronological peer group, that all says, "Oh, humanity is ready." No, humanity's not ready. I assure you, it's not ready. In fact, the people who claim humanity is ready are the least ready, because
Jeff,
they are the most willfully ignorant of the suffering of their own fellow human beings, but fellow beings on this planet, period.
I gotta say, Jeff, I'm not laughing at you or even anyone else, and I'm laughing at myself because I go through this internal debate every day. Are people ready? Are they not? I have to remind myself I'm also living in a bubble with respects to the content that I make, the things I work on. So I'm surrounded by people like yourself that are willing and hopefully ready to, and I speak for myself too, for this phenomenon to occur. But then you step out of that, and it's like, oh shit, there's another 7 billion people that just,
Correct.
yeah, yeah. Right.
Some of which are suffering from food insecurity right now as we speak. Some of which can't even get potable water.
Let alone have a have enough energy and be healthily fed to have a chat like this, you mean?
Correct.
Right.
So it's, however, in defense of all the hippies from my generation and older, individuals are ready. Certainly there are individuals who are capable and ready. But that's not the entire collective. And you're right in that ufology, as wonderful as it is, as much as I consider myself at least an occasional participant in the ufology community, and invaluable. So it's important to be able to say that, swords have two edges. Most of them, the European ones, they have two edges. So there's good and bad to this. There's good and bad to what we're doing. There's good and bad to ufology, and that's all okay. So long as we are aware of it, and so ufology, one, is very insular. So there's this idea ufology, we think in ufology that the rest of the world thinks like us, and we are a small, minute percentile of the species. Secondly, so our worldview is very skewed by the echo chamber we've built of ourselves. Right.
Can I just say very quickly, the example of the sword you gave, there's two sides, and then there's that thin middle point, that sharp edge that speaks to the collapsing of the wave, at least to me.
Yeah. So this goes to probabilities and outcomes, both predictively and manifesting them materially. So making
Right.
the wave function collapse where you want it.
Huh.
And that's where you put your attention.
Right.
So it goes, I don't want to lose my original train of thought, but
sorry.
Let me first get back to ufology. So ufology is, I'm grateful for it. I've been like you, like others, I've followed this topic most of my adult life, and like so many people who watch this, I've had my own experiences. Plenty of people who are watching this have had their own experiences, have their own thoughts, and aren't participating publicly, but they're there. you know. So ufology is big in that way and useful in that way. However, let's not forget first and foremost that ufology, and this isn't a bad thing, this isn't a judgment, this is just a thing we have to be honest about. Ufology is an entertainment industry.
Yeah. Yes.
And that's not a terrible thing, because for some people, the only way they're going to engage with this content at all is through the medium of entertainment. But let's be sure and be honest with ourselves about it.
Right.
And two, it's very, very, very insular.
Mm.
So going back to us being ready as a species, it is my current assessment, which I, hold at medium confidence, that no, we're not ready as a collective, but the phenomenon is trying to directly participate in a way to make us ready.
Would this speak to you, following that same train of thought as there's a saying that someone had said to me many, many months ago, a person is smart, people are stupid. Maybe that's a,
Yeah, I've said that myself.
oh wow, okay. Maybe it was you. Um, would it speak to that in a certain regard? I don't mean to just throw the baby out with the bathwater, but it takes internal this idea that people need to go through their own experiences before they realize they can come together, in the sense that I remember reading Lieutenant Colonel, I forgot his name, manuscript from decades ago, where he said we have two hands. We the left, when we wake up in the morning, the left hand doesn't spend its whole day trying to plot against hurting the right hand, or vice
Correct.
versa, right?
Correct.
So speaking
So
to
let's
that,
go back to this idea of the evolution of self-apprehension and consciousness, right?
sure.
So an individual can be highly evolved, right? But what is the collective? The collective yet is another form of individual, right? So you can be individually self-aware, but collectively, are you self-aware? The more self-aware our collective becomes, the more the baseline of the common denominator is raised.
I'm getting goosebumps because you're saying things that certain people we spoke about off the record have said to me word for word. Um, that's phenomenal. Sorry, is there anything
This
else?
goes back to the reduction of ontological shock and the
Right.
extraordinarily complex moving pieces when we talk about the three parties involved in disclosure. The
Mm,
party within the establishment that wants disclosure, the party within the establishment that does not want disclosure, and the phenomenon itself. So there is a complex three-way interaction
right.
between those three centers of gravity.
Right. Um, with respects to, for 2 3 minutes, I'd like to bring one of the things that I do the least. I'd like to actually do very quickly now, which is bring politics into the conversation with respects to taking a neutrally political perspective, but going back to this idea of rings and spirals and concentric rings atop, like big picture thinking. When we look, for example, and I say this with pure neutrality to the audience, because I'll give examples on both sides. When we look, for example, at what Cheney did under the Bush administration, all the things that were done then, and we look, for example, now, people saying, well, should some of these individuals, whether still alive or not, Rumsfeld, all Kissinger, Cheney, there's this big debate as to whether or not they should be facing some type of accountability for what many would argue would be the clear, potentially deliberate butchering of intelligence many years ago.
Yeah, that's a hot topic. And believe me,
Right.
if I were to have private conversations within the community, I would have some very passionate, heated things to say about the politicization of intelligence and how
Right.
much it pisses me off.
Okay, I was going to say, well, I would love your take on that, but also this idea of the concentric rings, where people say, well, it's 2022, we're going into 2023. What happened in 2001 or 2 or 3 with Iraq and Afghanistan, forget about all of that. It's all done.
Sure, there's an example most recently from, and you may have seen it, but a woman in her 90s was prosecuted for war crimes because she was a secretary at one of the Nazi concentration camps.
Yes, I saw that headline. Yeah.
And they ended up giving her like 2 years. For one, because she was a juvenile at the time,
Right.
So they tried her to juvenile court. I forget which government it was, but two, they gave her a probated sentence. Of course, what are you going to do?
Mm.
Incarcerate a 97-year-old woman for a
Well,
50-year-old, and
yeah.
especially when she was a child at the time.
Well,
Um,
yeah.
that's an example. So accountability, yeah. This goes. We can bring it even closer to home and talk about if and when we learn about legacy programs, you know,
Yeah.
what's the culpability there? And let me first say that there isn't an easy answer.
Right.
And I've said this plenty of times. People need to stop looking for easy answers in any of this.
Right. Whether it's politics as we know it or the phenomena, you mean?
Correct. Any of it. To include this, uh, the conclusions not only about the war in Iraq and WMD and all the falsification of intelligence there, blah blah blah. I mean, the list goes on. Again, if this was a private conversation I was having with intelligence professionals, the list of shit that pisses me off is pretty exhaustive.
Right. If I could say, with respects to see how even you and I are discussing this grand thinking big picture of, well, okay, that was 20 years ago. Let's, if we're going to punish anyone, let's simmer down the punishment, or that was 80 years ago, given the context of things. Do we think, going back to the beginning of this recording where we talked about, you brought up very well, this idea of unseen forces, do you think these unseen forces play a part in helping to dismiss, after the event has occurred, dismiss the accountability on some individuals, regardless of political party?
I don't know if if these elements are that granular in their mediating justice.
Right.
And let's to clarify some perspectives and some terms. There is a thin line often between justice and vengeance.
Yeah.
And there is also some relatively thin lines between egocentric validation versus being effective for the collective, right? So a
Right.
lot of times you get a choice. You can feel right and be vindicated and continue the status quo of conflict and combative narrative,
Mm.
or you can choose to be effective, which means whatever your ego concerns were, your needs for validation, all that stuff gets left behind.
Right. Right. So this concept of collectively viewing, to that point, where the masses, and I'm just
Here's
gonna.
the thing. Here's a way to address that.
Sure, sure.
Accountability versus punishment are not the same thing.
Right.
Is it worthwhile to hold them accountable in the sense that it's made very public what they did? Yes,
Right.
because that keeps us, in the collective sense, self-aware. That's why we're seeing a lot of the ugliness now, because we are becoming more self-aware as a collective. And that
Mm.
means a lot of the dark, awful, bad stuff that has always been there is now more visible.
Right. Doesn't mean
It
it
was
was.
always there.
Right. Right. Well, yes. Would there be an unseen force, perhaps, in your opinion, that we just discussed, playing on the mass consciousness to now recognize those things?
Yes, without
Oh,
question.
okay. Okay. All right. There we go. I was going to say, because I was going to use an example of, if a news network took a poll that was a genuinely truthful poll, and you see, for example, 15 years ago, there was the whole, or 20 years ago, why would we have to punish anybody, or hold them accountable, rather, excuse me, for, WMDs? And then now you have people saying, a good chunk of people will say, let it go because it was so many years ago. Others will say, no, 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 no. They should be absolutely held accountable. Right. And I
Right. So here's the middle answer. Don't concern yourself with punishing individuals, but concern yourself very much with knowing the truth of the fact pattern as it occurred so that it doesn't happen again.
right. So it doesn't. Right.
That's the real value in the accountability piece. Going after Dick Cheney or Don Rumsfeld now,
Right.
when I guess they're in their 80s,
Yeah.
who gives a shit? I mean, let's go back. I mean, if we again, this also this self-awareness in the collective sense goes back to us understanding our own history.
Mm,
We've all heard the saying, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. Well, it is so blatantly obvious and true when we forget where the Dick Cheneys of the world came from.
right,
Again, this big picture sense, do I vilify Dick Cheney for some of his choices? No. I
right,
understand the inputs that made him.
right, right. The
He
name,
didn't set out to be evil. He didn't wake up to say, aha, I'm gonna evilly wring his hands and go, I'm gonna run the world today and be evil. It's not what he did. It's not his career path.
right,
His career path certainly is on an ideological trajectory, but there are reasons for that. And so I'm not forgiving him or any prior
right,
politician.
right,
I'm not forgiving anybody. But what I'm saying is you have to be objective and understand how these things emerge. So wanting vengeance, which is what people half the time really want when they talk about justice, what they want is revenge.
right.
Um, Wanting vengeance doesn't really solve problems, and it just perpetuates a cycle. Now, this is a more philosophical argument between restorative or reparative justice versus punitive justice, blah blah blah. I'll be the first to tell you, and I wish more people would say things like this. And this is one of the points I would like to get across: is I'm more than willing to say I don't know.
Right.
It's an extraordinarily complex topic with a lot of inputs and a lot of data I don't have, so I'm prepared to say I don't know what the right answer is.
This goes to your point. This goes to, if I may, and please tell me if there's a bad correlation, but to the whole Batman Joker example. To what point does Batman cross a line or not cross a line to where he's become just like the Joker? And now it's kind of like things are now conflated.
Yeah, that's great. Uh, you know, uh, that's a lot to unpack about, you know, fighting monsters.
Right,
Um,
right,
yeah, it's real easy. And this goes back to something I'm invested in, which is the evolution of the warrior classes and why an ethos is so absolutely 100% critical. Because in those moments, in that context of adversity and austerity and actual lethal crisis,
yeah.
it is very, very, very easy to become dehumanized over time and not even realize it's happening.
Right. Right. In the just the same way that it is on the opposite end, where you have someone who's never been in battle and is sitting on their couch with a beer going, oh, looking at the news. If I was there, I would have done this, this, and that.
Correct.
Right. Right. So this idea, okay, because I was going to say as well, and I don't mean to get overly personal here, but perhaps yourself or others on the battlefield, I would imagine that such a mentality of literally, fighting monsters, fighting evil, if you will, there's a line that one, I guess perhaps, and tell me if I'm wrong, something that the military cannot necessarily entrain within you. It's something you have to hone yourself.
They
Cross.
try. The military tries, but it's very hard to do institutionally on the collective sense. And this goes, we can say, so there's this warrior ethos. All of the branches of the service have some expression of it. It's very pronounced for those of us who live on the ground with a weapon in our hands. Um, Honor is not a thing you think about. Honor is a thing you feel about. And I've had plenty of young kids working for me that weren't all that articulate, weren't even good spellers, but they knew what honor was.
Right. Right.
And so there is a sense of honor, and the sense of honor becomes codified. And so, I mean, for example, and then usually the branches will come up with cool little, uh, sayings or buzzwords or phrases. For the army, it was leadership, loyalty, duty, respect, self-service, honor, integrity, and personal courage. So those were the, you
Right.
know, an expression of those army values. They're very real values.
Right.
And a lot of us believe in them. A lot of us believe in the ethos of the quiet professional, and will become, morally offended when people violate that. And when you hear people brag about what they've done or where they've been, you automatically know they're lying,
Right.
because the real thing never
Doesn't
has to say who they are.
right.
Um, that being said, we go back to, let's talk politics in a bigger sense again. And this is why, although a lot of my proclivities are liberal, I lean left on a lot of ways. My the pathway to get to those in my mind are conservative. So for me, that's why I'm neither liberal or conservative, but a lot of my thinking is
Right.
on the right side of the aisle, is conservative, and that's because of this. You cannot make a better society by trying to condition society. You
I
make a better society by by conditioning the individual.
right. I see what you're saying. And this is something that is completely absent from our society. Would you agree?
Not completely absent, but I perceive it to be in deficit for sure, 100%. And there's the right intention, like, let's make the world safer, let's make the world kinder. No, stop trying to make the world anything. Make better people individually.
Uh, okay, now just curious, and I don't mean to put you on the spot here, but in the particular topic of this discussion, would you? That's something that I believe Jordan Peterson speaks on. Now, I know he's spoken on many other things that are people consider controversial, but in this
Right.
regard, would you agree in that regard? Um,
Yeah, I mean, as far as, it's funny, he's an interesting figure, and highly controversial.
right.
I've listened to, but also sometimes very interesting. I've listened to, him on occasion, not enough to be able to speak intelligently as to whether or not the allegations made against him are true. Maybe they are,
Right.
maybe they aren't.
Right.
But I've listened to him a couple of times, and I enjoyed what he had to say. I maybe would have said things differently, but
Right.
uh, it really boils down in my mind to individual value systems, individual perceptions, not trying to make reality or society at large do one thing or another.
Right. So to that point, when you have, for example, in a sense of, okay, now this, when you have an intelligence operation going on to relate it to your former line of work, if I may, and you have a situation where you're the target in which you're trying to effectuate, say, socially, psychologically, anthropologically, to make them change their beliefs. For example, perhaps this is part of some, this is just one, this operation is one element of a grander influence campaign. It is more ideal, as my research has found, and please tell me if I'm wrong, to bring that target into what's called a zone of proximity or creating proximity, where they're isolated physically from other external factors that could influence them and therefore affect your operation. When we look at this proximity to signature relative to density from before, would that fall in that same area?
Similar in ways, so two different approaches. Talking about, we can talk about a collective sense and influencing a society, or we can talk about in the icky
Right.
human subjective predatory sense, because a predator does the same thing, an
Right.
abuser does the same thing.
Right.
Abusers try to cut off the abused from a larger objective connection to other beings, other inputs, etc.
Right.
That usually doesn't work in the long run.
Mm. Because people wake up in numbers, I take it, or they speak up eventually.
Well, and the other thing is, you know, when we saw times when we fight things, we give those things power.
When we, sorry,
A lot of times when we fight things directly, we give those things power.
just by giving it attention and intention by fueling it.
Correct.
So, oh, like just like when someone does or doesn't respond, like a celebrity does or doesn't respond to a media story, sometimes not responding is the response.
Correct. And so when you look at frames of reference and influence, a lot of times, as opposed to saying, "Hey, those guys over there, they suck," it's better to say, "Look what we're doing for you."
Right. Right. That,
Now, there's a passive aggressive way to say that, address the others, the contested others, and that's to say, "Look what we're doing for you," and also they don't mean shit to us. They can't touch us at all.
huh. That
So that you've repositioned yourself, uh showing a hierarchy of effectiveness, like, we're better than they are because they can't do anything with us, but look what we're doing for you.
right. So you're okay, right. It seems that we seem to be, and I don't mean this necessarily politically, but residing within a civilization or society, at least in the West, where it's basically, hey, look at what they did, but it's very rarely in combination with, look at the resolution that we can provide if you come here.
Yeah, I mean, in fairness, we don't see that in public media without question. That dialogue isn't happening, but in fairness, the parts you aren't seeing, that dialogue does happen.
Fair enough. Yeah, I can attest to that as well. Yeah, yeah. These are the behind the scenes off the conversations and such.
And like the provisional reconstruction teams and all the other things we did to make the world a better place in places we are, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all kinds of things at the end user level you never hear about because of our sensationalist driven media. You rarely hear about good, successful things because that's not emotionally titillating.
Well, this goes back to, like, for example, and I bring this up, my audience will probably laugh or roll their eyes at this point, but the film Tenet, at the very end, when Robert Pattinson's character says, I'm not sure if you've seen it or not, he goes, nobody cares about the, in terms of the masses, nobody cares about the bomb that never went off.
Correct. That's a good statement.
Right.
Um,
Right.
let's talk about the intelligence community. I will be the first to tell you that 100% there needs to be oversight. One of the things that I'm sure lots of discussion is going on behind the scenes, and is even more probably the center of gravity in certain minds than the phenomenon itself,
Right.
is the implications of the compartmentalization process and the lack of oversight.
You're talking about bigot lists and SAPs and
Right, right. So the phenomenon doesn't piss me off. What some of our own institutions have done, that pisses me off greatly.
right.
Um,
Right.
and so there's all kinds of inputs to that discussion, because the counter to it, even though I'm pro oversight, pro we need to we need to uncover and dig up these silos, etc.
Right.
I also understand the context which created them, and I also understand what some of those program managers and people inside those silos would say and say, uh, look at our last election cycle. Did anybody behave like fucking functional adults? And you want to give them that?
Well, this is Jeff. If I can give a personal example that I'm willing to speak to say publicly, the as I've spoken on, not in hopefully not in a bragging manner, but some of the things that I've built some months ago that got the attention of some folks at DoD. With a few adjustments, within 10 minutes, it becomes a very serious weapon, which is why I'm not going to, blurt out to the world how to build it, because all it takes is one guy who's pissed off at his ex-girlfriend. And I'm serious. Like, it puts, it's a serious.
Yeah, I mean, so on the one hand, and the thing is, all of this is a sword with no hilt. It's all just blade, right?
Right. Right. Yeah. Yes.
Because the other side of that is the statement itself is filled with hubris, but it's also true.
Right.
Yeah, it's an arrogant position, but it's also a true one, because the flip side is for the common man or woman, the common person, to say, yeah, but now you're saying I'm an idiot, so I don't deserve the truth. So just no good to this.
Yeah.
And so the other side is, well, okay, maybe you're not an idiot, but the moron who cares far more about who won American Idol than what's going on in Ukraine right now is an idiot and should not have this truth.
Right. Well, see, this is
So that it's you can see.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm not justifying it, because my ultimate conclusion is, yeah, the idiot watching American Idol, they actually deserve the truth, because democracy works if it doesn't. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. We die as a species. I either live my values or I don't.
Right. This speaks to even this concept of occults, in the sense that if we look at the etymology of the word occult, it means to hide something.
Correct. It just means hidden.
Right. And this speaks to the whole concept of secret societies over the ages, certain individuals, and whether, poets, or nowadays, things like lawyers, and, yeah, having quote unquote double lives, where again, that sort of, a bunch of people in a room, in a shadowy room, may be a little more accurate than we'd like to think, with the sense of, okay, are the masses ready?
Correct.
Right.
But the people in the shadowy room aren't necessarily evil.
Right. Right.
We
Right.
take the we again put these two-dimensional cartoons over everything. We make everybody good guys or bad guys. Let's talk about shadowy groups, which I happen to be a fan of, right? The
Right.
working group was once called the aviary. You know what? I'm a fan of most of those people. Do they qualify as maybe a shadowy group? Yeah, they do.
Right. This, and what's interesting too is, if we were to dive into the psychology of the average person, including myself, it's this idea of, and I'm not trying to attack or go at anyone, any ideology or anything like this, just trying to explore it. This idea of, where people will say, well, the masses deserve to know, but then on the other hand, it's like, if one were to just reveal what that hidden group had hidden, you're gonna have a chunk of people that are gonna go bullshit.
Right. Well, this
So,
goes back to, and we look at the disclosure process, right? So
right,
let's say POTUS, walks up to the podium tomorrow and says, "I'd like to introduce to you Skinny Bob. He's been here the whole time."
right,
You know what? Half the people watching that are going to say, "Bullshit! It's a puppet. It's a robot. It's part of the government's plan." They won't believe him anyways.
right, right, right,
So this goes into some clandestine imperatives about how to communicate things in an environment, and in a information contested environment where you're dealing with principles of the or targets of the influence, which are automatically resisted. So when we look at the bigger picture of disclosure, A, reducing ontological shock, B, reducing potential for blowback, and C, dealing with the populace and a media complex which has already been compromised.
right,
You're left with the only effective way to introduce this information to the collective is essentially to lie the truth to you. They have to find ways to lie the truth to you. The reason for that, let's talk about lying for a second. If I lie to you directly, my position can be contested. But if I simply present to you the truth a certain way that you come to the conclusions I want you to have, you'll
right.
be hard pressed to be convinced otherwise.
That I
Because I didn't tell you, you came to those conclusions. And whenever you put yourself in your own confirmation bias echo chamber and
Right,
keep looking for the truth, which is true,
right.
it reinforces your position.
This is okay. I'm so appreciative of your saying that, man, because I couldn't agree more. And with that said, I would like to say, in fairness, to rebut and play devil's advocate to what I said earlier, that doesn't mean, in my opinion, just because a chunk of people are going to say Skinny Bob is a puppet, I don't think that should be the reason to keep things concealed. I'm just exploring ideas, just to be clear to the audience more.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
Yeah.
So that's the other part of the argument is yes, but yes, that's true.
Right.
And that sucks.
Right.
But we either we
Yeah.
either live our values or we don't, right?
Right.
And so let's look at governance and responsibility, right? People will always think it's this coveting of power. A lot of times it is.
Mm,
And we can talk about leadership culture issues, which I also are beefs with me and the establishment.
right.
A lot of times it is people just coveting power. A lot of times it's not.
Mm,
And it's literally people feeling the weight of responsibility for objective truths that the vast majority of the people who will watch this interview know nothing about, have no frame of reference for. They've never been to a hard, contested, failed state.
right. Right.
They have no frame of reference for what those people who have these responsibilities do. Now, that doesn't mean the people with responsibilities are making the right choices.
Right.
They're often making the wrong ones. However, I have empathy for how they get to those wrong conclusions.
I see. Okay, and then this enters the, without going too deep into this, please tell me if I'm wrong here, but I would imagine this is when one sort of dips their toe into the world of military intelligence tactics that are then used, whether officially or in non-official capacities, on people of status, let's say.
Yeah, influence operations. So
Right. And what if I can give a quick example? You have a politician, genuine, honest person, let's just say hypothetically, they have this incredible, say, 5, 10 year plan, but then they end up, for example, cheating on their wife, let's say, and it gets recorded. There's a whole honeypot
yeah,
thing.
the Soviets were real big on that.
Right, right.
Our, in fairness, and I know I'm sounding like a CIA apologist, but we certainly have that in the toolbox.
Hmm,
However, it's not those aren't the kind of tools we typically use.
got you. Okay.
And this goes to effectiveness. Just being effective. One of the things I've learned is that I've almost always far more effective by simply using the truth than I am by lying.
I think I see where you're going with this. This even leads to quantitative and qualitative risk analysis, right? In that situation.
Well, there's that, and there is the truth of the Western idea. I mean, a
Right.
lot of failures in the West, without question, are spiral into this hard material reductionism. I mean, the list goes on. The things, the problems of the
Sure.
West, we could,
Sure. Sure.
but we could. There's a lot of good that comes from it, right?
Right. Right.
Um, and so if I'm trying to recruit you,
Right.
it's a lot better if I just use the truth, even if it is a slightly amplified towards the good truth, to convince you to be on my side and then reward you with money.
Right.
So
This is
you believe in what you're doing, you don't feel icky like an asshole, and
right.
you're being rewarded.
And this is, I would imagine, I'm not saying in for better or worse, because that's arguably context driven, but I would imagine this is just one of a plethora of methods that have.
Oh, without question. I mean, that's so I was just talking about source recruitment,
Right.
campaigns of influence on individuals. I mean, we've certainly done them in the past. I mean, look, as much as I'm a fan of the intelligence community because I used to be a part of it, I would be a big, long, historical, awful list
Right. Right.
evil shit that the
Right.
intelligence community has done,
Right.
without question.
Right.
So don't ever let me,
No, no, no. I'm just,
come
if I could.
across as I'm defending them and they're the good guys. They're
No, no.
not.
As a matter of fact, you're exploring concepts just like myself. I don't think either of us are taking a position. If I could just throw in the last word before, and then I'll give it to you, and then we'll probably call it. This idea of, for example, you have a politician genuinely at heart means well, and what ends up happening is they have, say, a 10 year plan of what they want to do politically, and then there are certain elements, whether foreign or domestic or perhaps both, that realize, not agencies, but perhaps elements within such, that realize or don't want that agenda to be carried out, whether for better or worse. They end up, say, in this example, honeypotting this particular politician, so that if that dirt they have on them gets out, that politician cannot execute, or can far less execute, their political plan. The question becomes, who, if
Or
that's
are they compromised? Yeah. So I mean, let's get a real example of it. That's not even a part of an agency, and that was a guy who just had the money and influence and tried his best to do it, and that's Jeffrey Epstein.
with respects to the with the tactics and the.
Of recruiting
Right,
people to his little fantasy island and trying to
right.
catch people in compromising positions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That was I personally believe that he was operating independently. It just was part of his own agenda.
Do you think he could have been, by not to veer off topic here, but do you think he could have been selling to the highest bidder with respects to an agency?
Maybe
Right,
anything's possible. That may have been part of his master plan, and was to compromise people and then sell that
right.
information to the highest bidder. Maybe, but that's an example of those compromising. But let's look at self compromise.
Sure, sure.
Uh, Politicians, again, I refuse to believe people just wake up evil or are born evil.
Yeah,
There's a path that gets them there.
right.
Usually.
Right.
Real evil does exist. I'll be the first to tell you, real evil is a thing that does exist. However, more often than not, it's human ignorance and failing, not
There's a trail
real
that's led
evil.
there. Right.
Yeah, there's not real evil. Um, so there's politicians who compromise themselves, meaning they want to do the highest thing, the highest good, and they realize they have to compromise. Well, they compromise in certain things, and then they're compromising a little more, and then
Right.
they're compromising a little more.
Right.
So let's, going back to our government doing bad shit. Well, contrary to the belief that there's, some evil group of old guys in the Pentagon, which there may be, but putting that aside,
Right.
perceived exigency, complacency and oversight, and gradualism. That's usually the three factors each and every time.
Right.
Like when we look at some of the evil, awful crap that the CIA and the intelligence community did in the past, not excusing it at all, but I understand the context of the Cold War. And when we talk about things coming to the surface again, I mean, we look at the battle in Ukraine. In my mind, it's the last true battle of the Cold War. This is
Right.
the true end of the Cold War. But the existential threat that your generation and younger are now feeling,
Right.
that's how my generation grew up. We grew up with the existential angst that some people, younger people watching this right now, feel now. My whole generation lived our entire lives, our entire childhood and teenage years with that feeling.
And that goes back to what you said about inputs.
Correct.
Right.
And
Right.
so a lot of the horrible, awful, bad stuff, MK Ultra, you name it, list is
Or-
long, all the things you never heard about,
Right.
you know, you
Right.
know, was born of the Cold War. And it wasn't just a political game. It was very, 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 very real. Let's look at the phenomenon again. What was the messaging of the phenomenon? Well, it's come up countless times where they started messing with nuclear weapon systems. They too, the phenomenon too, were operating in the context of the Cold War for the sake of their messaging.
And also
So
perhaps
the phenomenon remembers the Cold War, even if your generation doesn't. I remember it, and the phenomenon
you know what
remembers
I
the
also
Cold War.
took that as well. To your point, I took that as well too as the phenomenon, whatever whomever the source is, if not multiple, basically saying with the nuclear facilities, whether in Soviet Union or in the West, basically going whether turning them on or off, saying, listen, your most dangerous stuff are crayons to us. So don't try it.
I don't know if that was the messaging as it was simply to bring attention to you are closer to the end of the world than you think. That's the messaging I get from it.
Right. Okay.
Because the part of the gamesmanship of the Cold War was this belief of, oh yeah, it's a theoretical possibility, but it'll never happen. And the phenomenon is saying, no, it's a lot closer than you think.
Right. I see where you're okay. You know what? I would upgrade or readjust my position to agree with you much more strongly there. Yeah. Because that if they wanted to basically say we control you or we own you or whatever, they could do it in much more nonchalant ways
They've
than
already done that.
right, right.
That's part of the equation about discussing what is the most likely course of action and most probable, or it's the most probable course of action phenomenon. What is the most dangerous course of action for the phenomenon going forward,
Right.
and what is the U.S. response or global response to the phenomenon, and having to entertain that question. And this all goes back to one of the greatest fears all governments have is the perceived loss of legitimacy. And so the phenomenon is presenting itself as going back to what we were just talking about influence.
Right.
The phenomenon is presenting itself in a way of what I just said we do. Again, we are the unwitting apprentices of the phenomenon. We always have been. The
Right.
phenomenon can present itself in a way that says, look, we can do whatever we want. And by the way, your governments, they're powerless. They already are in position to say that and do that if they choose.
Right.
They are presenting the existential threat of that to governments in order to provoke disclosure. Right? So one of the things that's happening behind the scenes now is, look, we're dealing with the inevitable. So here's we look at the pathways of blowback, right?
Right.
let's say they pop out of the, you know, Pacific tomorrow and they show up in mass over LA in the digital age. They did that even 30 years ago. It's an impact that could have been mitigated, not now. They
Right.
do that now. That's why, the people who are saying, "Oh, it'll never happen, the government's gonna backslide." The government elements from the government may try to backslide. They will not be successful, and it will not occur because this is a different age. And so, and I'm plenty of voices of the community who are voices I admire and like, but they're my generation, and they have this long view to say, "Oh no, this will all go back under the rug again." No, it won't, because the human consciousness has changed. That's the whole point.
Right.
Human connectivity has changed. That's the whole point. Ideological drift with the change of generational cohorts inside the establishment itself has occurred.
Right. And even if
All of those things are true now that were
right.
not true even 10 years ago, let alone 30 years ago or 50 years ago. So we live in a different era. So if phenomenon shows up in mass tomorrow, it's a game changer. If they do that and the government is caught not saying something before it happens,
Yeah.
the government by default is delegitimized
You've already created distrust between the populace and the governors or the government.
and shown that you're powerless. So there's two possible outcomes, one of which is, um, hey, the government has shown it's powerless, therefore delegitimized. Worse, the government has showed that it's powerless and it lied about it.
Mm.
Incredibly, both
Yeah.
those outcomes are bad, but one is far worse than the other.
And if I can add very quickly, imagine to your example, in addition to coming out of the Pacific, a bunch of craft or motherships or anything, let's say, imagine if the person that you know is your neighbor automatically decloaks and there's something else entirely.
Oh, sure. The walking among us, that goes back to, we've talked about that before, the Jacob scenario. Are the if the hybrids, and these are big ifs, and let me
Right.
just say,
Yep.
I got to caveat this and say, because this doesn't get said enough, the nature of the topic is as such that we have to have the conversation, we have to talk in speculation, we have to use a lot of ifs.
Yes.
Let me say right now to those watching and who aren't familiar with the intelligence process, the more ifs you have to use in your assessment, the more likely your assessment is wrong. We don't
Right.
like to use ifs.
Right. That because that deals with uncertainties, and that's not what intel people like.
Correct.
Right.
However, the nature of the topic is such that we have to. So let us assume that the hybrid children or the hybrid beings so many people have experienced, and I don't at all doubt the experience.
Right.
Like we said last time, the nature of reality itself may be so mutable that just because the experiencer had the very legitimate, real, bona
Right.
fide experience
Yes.
still doesn't make it real,
Right. I
right?
got you. Absolutely.
That being said, let's say that the physical beings observed are in fact physical beings meant to at some point manifest on this planet in a very real corporal way that we interact with, etc.
Right.
They're not being trained as infiltrators, they're being trained as immigrants because the infiltrators are already here.
Right.
Who are the infiltrators? Well, the infiltrators are watching this interview. It may be infiltrators participating in this interview. Why is that? Because the most effective way to hide a fifth column is to ensure that it does not know that it is one. Let's
Right.
go back to all the awful mind control experiments that the US and the Soviets are doing during the Cold War. Why were they doing that? Well, because of what I just said. If you're, a fifth column actor, you don't even know it. No one's ever going to find you.
That's 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 goddamn solid strategy. At the
Right.
right. That at the very least. Yeah.
So let's
Right.
look at the two chief instruments of phenomenon: applied pressure through presence, which is just them showing up in presentation, is a pressure, which is a cycle of stimulus and response.
Right.
and subtle noetic influence. Now, if you were conscious, you were self-aware, you
Right.
detect the influence. If you were not self-aware, you just think you had an idea.
Man, that's so well said. I see. This is just this. If I can give a practical example to that, and then I'm really sorry, but in the next couple minutes I'll have to wrap it. But the idea of someone coming, or the example of someone coming home from a long day at work, and they grab a beer, they hop on the couch, and they turn the TV on, and one person flips through a bunch of news channels and says to themselves, something, why is it that all these news channels are displaying the same things, for example, the same stories, aside from there being some big event, of course, and then the other person just going, not even realizing that as they flip through the channels, the same, in this example, words are literally being repeated by various hosts from around the country. Right.
Right. So unfortunately, when we talk about syndicated media,
Right.
we're
Right.
no longer talking about journalism. We're talking about another form of entertainment, and
So
which uses the same marketing cycles and marketing feedback loops that advertisers do. And
this is
that's the use of key buzzwords. That's the use of key timing. You know, get to a suspenseful moment, show you a commercial, come back, play some theme music, tell you that what happened again. That all firing, following this kind of. And so as an intelligence professional, become very biased and like, I don't want your opinion piece. I don't want your talking head program. I want raw information without sensationalism of any kind.
and if I could say
I
as
do
well,
not want to be entertained. I want you to be rapid fire. Give me information that's hard, concise, facts, and fact pattern. Then you can give me your probable assessments. Then you have to rate those assessments with veracity, accuracy, etc.
but you want actionable, you're saying give me actionable intelligence.
Yeah, or shut the fuck up. Don't talk to me. Either tell me information I want, or just shut
Right.
up. And
Right.
I got to be careful not be bitter and cynical, because I lean that way, but the other side is the human emotive rapport piece, which is an important part of us being humans and being social creatures,
Right.
which has value too. It's
Right.
just that when I process information, I don't rely on that side.
Well, no, can I just say to support your point entirely? I mean, and I will give examples for the audience, two examples, one on either end of the spectrum politically in this case. You have had Rachel Maddow from MSNBC, and you've also had Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson, if I'm not mistaken, taken to court based on claims they've made. And on either end of the spectrum, their lawyers, MSNBC's lawyers and Fox News,
they're just mirrors of each other. Those
right.
two in particular are just the same creature wearing different colored fur, man. It's just the same creature.
Well, and then the lawyers would argue in court, which this argument always stands as, well, our client, the TV host that made this erroneous claim or whatever it is, regardless of the political spectrum, they're just entertainers. They're not news journalists, or they're not, and this is a claim I've seen on documented paperwork in court affidavits. And then
Correct.
the judges go, okay, throw out the case.
Correct.
Right. Right.
And so the rise of the infotainment industry has been the greatest bane to the continued trajectory of the Western world, and part of this is failure to take responsibility. So here's the thing, just to leave people with: I want freedom. I want everyone's freedom.
Right.
I am a zealot when it comes to freedom and sovereignty, to the point that I am an interventionist. I do not believe in, oh, let those people solve their own problems. No, fuck that. I'm not going to let another Homo sapiens sapien on this planet be oppressed if there's some way I can stop it.
Right. In other words, the bully in the schoolyard example.
Whatever, pick
Sure.
one.
Sure.
At any rate, however, this is what's true about freedom, and this is one of the failures of ufology. Freedom is a form of power, and power must always be accompanied with responsibility.
Right.
And ufology has been egregiously irresponsible in the name of freedom.
And even infotainment, perhaps.
Correct. And look, again, going back to what I said, I'm not vilifying ufology as a whole.
No.
Even entertainment, I watch some of the entertainment. For some people, their way into this is entertainment, and that's okay. I want those people to be reached, right? So it goes back to other kinds of doctrine, for upaya, skillful means. We speak certain ways to certain people so they get the message, in
Right.
parables, if you will. And to people who are closer to the truth in their own personal evolution, we give them, a more um, refined or realized message, right? So ufology can be seen in the same light. I'm not knocking. There are guys I follow and listen to in this industry, because it's an industry, who I like, and I also recognize as sort of entertainers, and they're serving their purpose. So I don't want to completely knock that.
Right.
But
Right.
we see time and time and time again these entertainers that are popular, their shows are watched regularly. Uh, and by the way, I don't consider your show part of that, because
Oh,
A, you're not quite as big, and B, you're really dialing, drilling down on topics
thank you.
in such a way that it's like, as you yourself have noted, a lot of people just you're over their heads, frankly, and so they get turned off by that. But
But
at
see,
any rate, so you've
I would
got
say to your point, that doesn't deter me in any regard. It just makes me go, okay, there's some people that will not track, and so be it. But it doesn't
right,
just
and so there are programs for them, and you're fulfilling the role of people who are
right,
farther along in a path and think at a different level of fidelity about the topic. But anyways, so we've had numerous instances of a lot of key personalities in ufology who made lots of money
right.
being proven fraudulent, and they were entertained by all of these infotainers in ufology, and not a word is said about it after the fact. And I want to tell those people, look, you failed to do due diligence. You wanted the clicks and the views, and so you entertained a charlatan, and now you've said nothing about it after they've been proven false.
To your
That's
point,
irresponsible.
actually, I can tell you, Jeff, to your point, actually, sir, there have been many academics, even high level ones behind the scenes, that have said to me, Dave, some of them are pondering, considering coming on my show, and a select others, few others, because they've said, we want to speak to the UFO community genuinely, but the mediators that facilitate those conversations, a lot of times the hosts, they're infotainers not looking for actual data. And again,
Correct.
there's nothing wrong with the infotainers side, but if the raw data implies something that is against the infotainer's audience's confirmation bias box.
Well, this is the thing, and again, that I'm an advocate, a zealot for
Right,
individual sovereignty and freedom. However, I
right.
also recognize that freedom is power, and power must be accompanied by responsibility. Ufology must become more responsible.
Or else I couldn't agree more, or else it's just going to be dismissed or
Or the insiders who get vilified. I mean, as you know, we've talked about, it's
right.
happened to me where, oh, he's a disinfo agent. I'm some old retired guy. I'm not working for anybody.
I get accused of it. I get accused of it at least a couple times a week. So trust me, I hear
So
you.
so so that being the case, um, where are they now? Where are the Lou Elizondos now? They're not talking anymore. And you know why? Because they've come to the conclusion that talking to ufology is not useful, because it's an irresponsible entertainment industry.
So you're saying that, and I would agree that certain people like yourself, people like Mr. Elizondo and many others are more so interested in having meaningful conversations with, say, scientists, albeit those conversations will probably never go public, but at least there's progress.
Yeah, and I know I've just beat up on ufology. Again, I don't want to knock its good parts.
Right,
Lots
absolutely.
of good.
Yeah,
We're having this conversation now because of ufology. Um, Ufology has moved the ball forward. I mean, there are certainly key personalities within ufology that have been at this for years, decades,
right.
and whose efforts have been invaluable. So I don't want to take away from those. There are the
Absolutely.
Stanton Friedmans of the world, and I never want to take away from their accomplishments.
Right.
What I would like to suggest is ufology needs to become what? More self-aware.
Mm,
Funny how most of us start saying the same thing phenomena has been telling us to say. Become more self-aware.
right.
Because
Right.
what is one of the desired end states of the phenomenon? Well, my assessment currently is to change the architecture of human consciousness.
And can I just say, Jeff, if someone says, for example, well, how do we become more self-aware? I would very respectfully say, and this is just me, take your finger or your mouse, rewind this video to the beginning, and then play it. And then we can argue those conversations, by definition, help create self-awareness, perhaps.
They do. And so one of the things that to countering confirmation bias, one, ask questions, but
Right.
start with your side first. Whatever side you're on, whatever camp you're in, red camp, blue camp, doesn't matter. Whatever camp you're in, question your side first.
Right. I see. Right. Right. And then work from there.
You may be the good guy. You may be on the right side.
Right.
Prove it first. Play the devil's advocate to yourself first.
Right.
Then question the other guys.
Right. Well, brother, with that said, I want to thank you so much for coming on. We just crossed, I think, the hour and a half mark, and I do unfortunately have another call to jump onto. But I want to thank you immensely, man. If it's cool, if you could stay on after I finish the recording here. And is there any last words you wanted to say to the audience?
No, it's been a pleasure. Again, I like this show. I really am engaged with your line of inquiry, even though I think, there may be little pieces I think you're wrong or maybe misinformed because you didn't have the source to tell you differently.
Right, right.
I like the level of inquiry.
Thank you.
And again, I said some bad things about ufology. I'm not knocking ufology as a whole. It isn't valuable. And even the entertainers, they still have their value. And I don't want to take away from people who are listening to the Art Bells of the world, and who are being entertained by it. I don't want to take away from that, because it is the pathway in for many who wouldn't have. It's the gateway drug. Art Bell is a gateway drug to serious discourse, right?
Right.
But I just think we need to become more self-aware, and it's funny. We talked about infiltrators. There's unwitting assets, which many of us are. At some point, you become a witting asset and go, yeah, this is. Right now, I guess me and Phenomenon have shared agendas, so I'm going to say the same thing they'd want me to say, which is become more self-aware.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, with that said, man, thank you so very much. Everyone on my end, of course, you know where and how you could find this show and channel. Of course, if you're listening or watching to this, you've already found it. So thank you so very much, brother. And we'll catch you next time. Happy New Year, Christmas, the holidays to yourself, to the audience.
Yeah, you too. And happy holidays to everybody watching this, whatever they celebrate.
Thank you so much. All right. Cheers, man. Cheers, guys.